The knock at the door came just after noon, when the lake lay still under a pale winter sky. My father stepped inside with the air of a man delivering good news. Sliding a cashier's check across the table, $12,000. Enough to start over, he said, almost proud. Then came the blow. He had sold the cottage. My cottage, for $3 million, the house I had rebuilt board by board. The one my mother left in my care, was suddenly spoken of as if it were his to give away. He expected me to break, to shout, to beg. Instead, I smiled faintly and let the silence linger. He thought this was my ending. What he didn't know was that I had already set the trap. When my mother passed, I was 24 and still learning how grief shapes a life. The probate judge in Rockland signed the papers transferring the cottage to me. But it didn't feel like a gift, it felt like a sentence. The house had been falling in on itself for years, shingles curling, windows swollen with rot, floorboards sagging where water had crept in. My father's attention was already drifting elsewhere, toward quick ventures and whispered promises of easy money. But I stayed. Someone had to. By day, I worked jobs in Camden, managing storefront books and waiting tables during tourist season. By night, I stripped wallpaper, replaced joists, and sanded floors until my hands blistered. Each repaired beam felt like a conversation with my mother, a dialogue I refused to let die. The cottage wasn't just a house, it was proof I could endure. Meanwhile, my father grew restless. He called often, his tone a mixture of charm and desperation. One week it was a bridge loan, the next a truck repair, then a late mortgage payment on a house in Belfast he swore he could flip. Each request arrived wrapped in urgency, and more often than not, I said yes. I told myself it was family duty, that if I refused, he would spiral into ruin. But deep down, I believed something else. If I controlled the money, maybe I could control the chaos. That belief became my leash. Every dollar I wired him, every bill I covered, every quiet bailout kept him afloat but pulled me deeper into silence. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I didn't press him for promises he'd never keep. I simply became the steady wall he leaned against. Even as the weight bent me, he mistook my sacrifice for permission. And I let him. The contrast between us grew starker with every season. While I patched roofs and shoveled snow away from the stone steps, he shuffled cards in poker halls and whispered to drinking buddies about the next sure thing. I endured the ache of labor. He chased shortcuts that collapsed as quickly as they were built. Yet somehow, when he looked at me, he spoke as though I were the one with everything to prove. I remember one winter when the furnace gave out just as a cold snap rolled through. The contractor's invoice was steep, more than I had in my savings. But I wired the money without hesitation. My father called 2 days later, voice casual, asking if I could float him a few hundred to cover a lost bet. He never asked how I kept warm that week, never wondered if I had anything left. His assumption was simple: I would always have enough. And if I didn't, I would find a way. Reliability became my brand, and then my cage. At family gatherings, relatives praised me as the strong one, the dependable daughter. They said it like a compliment. But I heard the subtext: strong enough to carry, steady enough to be forgotten. My father leaned into that narrative until it became his shield. He told himself I could handle the burden, which excused him from ever carrying it. What he never saw, what no one seemed to see, was the cost. Each late-night phone call I answered, each loan I extended, each silent sacrifice eroded a piece of me. The cottage stood as my only witness. The one place that returned my investment with something real. The warmth of the wood stove, the glow of fresh paint, the solid weight of new floorboards under my feet. Those were the dividends I could count on. But endurance is not the same as freedom. I thought by controlling the purse strings, I was controlling the danger. In truth, I was only feeding it. My father's schemes grew bolder, his debts deeper, until the cottage itself became his target. That was when I realized the lines I had drawn were made of chalk, too easily smudged by a man who mistook my loyalty for weakness. I should have known then that sacrifice without boundaries is not love, it is exploitation. And I should have understood sooner that when someone learns you'll never default, They will never stop collecting. The warning came late one evening, carried in the uneasy voice of Owen, a friend who knew more than he wanted to. He'd been sitting at a bar in Rockport, half listening to the chatter over cheap whiskey, when my father's voice cut through the din. Ronan wasn't whispering, he was boasting. He told the table the cottage would be gone within the week, that a buyer was already lined up, and that the money was practically in his pocket. And then, with a laugh sharp enough to cut, he bragged that I was too naive to notice a signature slipped under my hand. That laughter traveled across the bar and through Owen's phone like a blade aimed directly at me. By the next morning, I was sitting in the office of Claire, a property attorney in Rockland whose reputation was as steady as granite. I laid out everything, the check my father had handed me, Owen's warning, the years of debts and demands. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice crisp. A forged power of attorney is already in motion. If we don't act now, the registry could record a deed before you even see it. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just family betrayal, it was a legal ambush. And the only way to fight it was with records, not rage. Within hours, Claire prepared the documents transferring the cottage into an irrevocable trust, naming me lifetime beneficiary and trustee. I signed each page with deliberate strokes, my signature steady even as my stomach churned. Alongside that, she drafted a fraud alert affidavit for the Knox County Registry of Deeds. A tripwire waiting to snap if any forged papers tried to slip through. For the first time in years, I felt a line harden in ink that even my father couldn't cross. But preparation wasn't enough. I wanted proof, receipts, timestamps, the kind of evidence no one could twist. Back at the cottage, I installed cameras above the entryway, in the kitchen rafters, in the office where my father liked to spread papers across the desk. Their small red lights blinked only for me, silent witnesses waiting for the moment he tried to act. Claire's investigation dug deeper. She arranged for a handwriting expert in Portland to analyze old samples of mine, tax forms, insurance claims, even my mother's will, side by side with the so-called power of attorney. The differences screamed from the page. Loops too shallow, pressure uneven, a practiced forgery by someone who thought imitation could pass for intimacy. Meanwhile, she traced the buyer's supposed account. It led to one of my father's old poker companions, a man whose finances looked more like a shell game than a business. Small deposits, sudden withdrawals, funds shuffling in restless movements before disappearing entirely. It wasn't a sale, it was a scheme, already collapsing before it reached daylight. Late one evening, Claire's phone rang. The clerk at the registry had flagged a packet dropped after hours, documents rushed. Signatures that made her pause. "Don't worry," she told Claire. "They won't slip through unnoticed." In that steady voice, I heard something stronger than law, the quiet loyalty of someone who refuses to look away. I spent those days in a strange rhythm, moving between waiting and working. By day, I reinforced window frames and stacked firewood, grounding myself in the cottage's bones. By night, I cataloged evidence, scanned bank records, filed Owen's statement, backed up the camera footage. Each act was a thread in the net I was weaving, a record of truth designed to catch lies the moment they surfaced. My father thought silence was my weakness. What he didn't know was that silence had become my weapon, because this time I wasn't carrying his burden. I was documenting it. When Owen called again, offering to sit with me through the waiting, I almost said yes, but I told him no. Control felt safer than comfort, and I convinced myself I had to steer every hinge alone. His sigh was soft but disappointed. I hated myself a little for pushing him away, but I couldn't let anyone touch the edges of my plan. The cottage was no longer just shelter, it was evidence. Fortified with trust filings, affidavits, and blinking red lights, I was no longer the daughter waiting to be blindsided. I was the witness, the archivist, the keeper of receipts. And as I looked at the folder growing thicker on Claire's desk, I thought of the words that had become my mantra. I don't want sympathy. I want signatures and timestamps. The Summit Grill was dressed in glass and steel, its windows overlooking Rockland's waterfront where the last light of day flickered against the breakwater. My father had chosen the restaurant with the flourish of a man convinced of his own triumph. When I walked in, he was already seated, a bottle of wine chilling in its bucket. Menus spread out like stage props. His smile was wide, too rehearsed, as though the performance had already begun. "Sable," he greeted, rising slightly, his voice brimming with cheer. "This is a night for goodbyes. But also beginnings. You'll see." I folded the napkin across my lap, letting him savor the illusion. He poured 2 glasses of wine and raised his in a toast. "To your freedom," he said, eyes shining with a pride he hadn't earned. "No more carrying that place alone. I've relieved you of the burden." I let my glass touch his but didn't drink. He leaned back, satisfied, and launched into his speech. $3 million wasn't a bad price. The buyer was respectable, and wasn't he generous for cutting me a check at all? His words slid over me like ice, calculated to make me feel indebted. What he didn't realize was that the play he thought he was writing was already scripted by me. Halfway through the meal, the air shifted. Claire stepped into the dining room, her presence steady, her eyes scanning until they found mine. She approached the table with practiced ease, as if this encounter were nothing more than chance. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her tone polite but pointed. My father's brows rose, but he gestured toward the empty chair, still confident that every card was in his hand. We ordered dessert we had no intention of eating. The waiter cleared the plates. The room softened with the clink of glasses and murmured conversations. Then Claire leaned forward, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Ronan, I happened to stop by the registry this week. Interesting timing on some documents filed under your name." His fork paused mid-air. "What documents?" She reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the trust filings, stamped, dated 3 days earlier, along with the fraud alert affidavit. "This cottage," she said evenly, "is no longer vulnerable to your signatures. It belongs to an irrevocable trust, with Sable as lifetime beneficiary. Any deed attempted afterward is void." For a moment, silence stretched across the table. Even the waiter, passing by, seemed to hesitate mid-step. My father's face flushed, the practiced charm draining away. He rifled through the pages, flipping faster as if speed might undo the ink. "You can't do this to me," he growled. "I already had a buyer." Claire's expression didn't waver. "That so-called buyer is linked to a shell account in Warren. Funds never cleared escrow. If you represented otherwise, that qualifies as fraud." He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing louder than the music drifting through the room. "You think you're clever, but I poured years into that property. Paid bills when your mother couldn't. Sable owes me." The words burned, but I kept my composure. "I don't owe you theft." My voice was steady, even. For the first time, he blinked. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if conspiracies could save him. "You don't understand. I'm drowning. Creditors breathing down my neck. Selling that place was my chance to stay afloat." Claire's tone sharpened. "And forging a signature? Exploiting your own daughter? Under Maine law, that's document fraud, attempted theft by deception, and financial exploitation of a family member. The district attorney could press charges tomorrow." The room seemed to shrink. Glasses clinked distantly, but at our table, silence reigned. His shoulders sagged, the swagger gone, replaced by something smaller, almost pleading. He searched my face for sympathy. I let him look and gave him none. For years, I had carried his debts, his schemes, his endless hunger for more. Tonight, the burden was back on his shoulders where it belonged. Claire closed her folder, the signal that the conversation was finished. My father slumped back in his chair, staring at the window where the lighthouse blinked steadily against the darkening sky. The performance was over. The audience, myself, Claire, and everyone within earshot, had already judged the truth. And in that silence, I realized I wasn't the one on trial anymore. The morning after the confrontation at the Summit Grill, I drove back to Claire's office in Rockland. The tide along the shore was still low, the harbor gulls circling lazily as if unaware that my life had shifted overnight. On her desk lay the same folder from the dinner, its pages marked with yellow tabs. She looked me in the eye and asked the question that had been waiting for me all along. What outcome do you want? Sable? I breathed slowly before answering. I don't want this swept under the rug. But I also don't want to see him in handcuffs if there's another way. The words felt like ash in my mouth. But they were honest. Claire nodded. Already writing. We would initiate civil action, not to punish, but to preserve leverage. Alongside it, she drafted a restitution framework. My father would liquidate what he could, begin repayments, and attend mandatory financial counseling. He would also sign a covenant forbidding him from contacting me about the property or interfering with the trust. Any breach would trigger both the civil suit and the criminal referral already prepared in the district attorney's office. That afternoon, I sat with Owen in a Camden cafe, steam rising from our mugs as I explained the plan. He frowned, staring into his coffee. You realize he'll say you're destroying him, that you've been poisoned against your own father. Maybe both can be true, I said quietly, but silence isn't an option anymore. It was fragile peace, but it steadied me. Back at the cottage, I began with the locks. New hardware gleamed against the old pine doors. Each turn of the wrench was more than a repair, it was a line drawn in steel. Afterward, I walked the shoreline, noting where erosion had crept closer. Under Maine's coastal rules, I set stone buffers and planted native grasses, rebuilding defenses both literal and symbolic. Inside, the walls seemed to breathe again. For the first time in years, I felt the house wasn't trembling under threat. I hung 2 frames above the mantel. One held my mother's original deed, yellowed but still legible in her careful hand. The other displayed the trust certificate, crisp and formal proof of survival. Together, they told a story that no fraud could erase. But boundaries are tested. My father tried slipping around them. He called Owen, spinning the same lines about loyalty and blood. But Owen didn't bend this time. If you want to talk about money or the house, he told him firmly, do it through Claire. When Owen told me later, I nearly cried, not from sadness, but from relief so sharp it hurt. At my next meeting with Claire, I admitted something I hadn't dared to say aloud. The tighter I make things, the more alone I feel. I keep thinking if I control every hinge, every dollar, nothing can touch me, but it leaves no room for anyone else to stand beside me. She closed the file gently. Safety matters, she said, but walls can turn into cages if you never open the gate. Her words stayed with me as summer turned toward fall. Camden filled with tourists. Markets piled high with blueberries and honey. And for the first time, I let myself step outside the shadow of defense. Instead of only guarding what was mine, I decided to build something for others. I worked with a local land trust to establish a small grant fund for homeowners facing deed fraud. Within weeks, applications arrived, neighbors coerced into signing papers they didn't understand, elders tricked by fine print. For the first time in months, my vigilance grew into something larger than myself. Meanwhile, restitution began. Small payments, clipped from the wages my father earned repairing boats in Owl's Head, arrived each month. I kept every receipt in a folder, not for revenge, but because the record mattered more than his promises ever did. Then came a letter in his hand, plain and unadorned, no excuses, no apologies, just a single request to stand at the road and look at the cottage one more time. After days of weighing, I allowed it, supervised. From the gravel shoulder beyond the gate, he came, silent, eyes on the roofline, the chimney, the birches shifting in the breeze. His face gave nothing away, but for the first time, his silence felt like respect. By September, I understood the truth. The future would be written in boundaries, not bargains. A year passed, measured not by drama but by steady compliance. Claire's updates showed partial repayments. Counseling sessions attended, no breaches. It didn't erase what he had done, but it carved a rhythm of accountability I could live with. One evening, as the first bite of autumn reached the air, I placed 3 things in a shadow box above the mantel. The steel key I once wore around my neck, the trust certificate with Claire's crisp filing stamp, and a photograph of the cottage my mother had taken the summer before she died. The key no longer needed to rest against my skin. It belonged behind glass now, an artifact and a promise. The cottage stood firm, the lake catching the light like polished glass. My father's shadow lingered beyond the gate, but he no longer stood inside. That boundary was mine to keep. And this time, it would hold. Above the mantel, the shadow box hangs quiet, my mother's original deed. The trust certificate filed under my name. And the steel key I no longer wear. 3 small artifacts, but together they tell the story of what was nearly stolen, and what I reclaimed. For years I thought endurance was enough. But endurance is not the same as freedom. In the end, boundaries protected what love could not. Now the cottage breathes with its own quiet life. The lake shifts like glass outside the window. And for the first time, the silence feels safe. My father's shadow may linger beyond the gate, but it no longer crosses into my home. Have you ever been forced to draw a hard line with family? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more true, hard-won victories and lessons on reclaiming your own power.